At the end of World War II, the Allies had to decide what to do with liberated territories from the defeated powers. One of these places that became problematic was the Korean Peninsula. Korea had been annexed by Japan for decades and had been controlled by China before that. The Soviet Union and the United States decided to divide the peninsula at the 38th parallel, with the idea of eventually reuniting them into a single independent country. The Soviets placed a client of theirs, Kim Il-sung, in the north, and the United States made use of a client of its own, Syngman Rhee, in the south. These two men tended to develop their regions, though, after their sponsor states, and so a communist North Korea developed and a more democratic South Korea developed at the same time. Both men also harbored visions of reuniting the country under themselves. In 1950, Kim Il-sung, operating primarily on his own authority, attempted just that, and North Korean forces invaded the South. The United States, which had left token American troop forces in South Korea, appealed to the United Nations for intervention in the crisis. The UN decided to go ahead and commit troops to this, in part because the Soviet Union, who could have vetoed the operation, were boycotting on account of the UN's failure to recognize Communist China in the Security Council. UN forces, mostly U.S. troops, with a U.S. commander, Douglas MacArthur, then moved into the South Korean peninsula. The very successful amphibious landing at Incheon actually put UN troops behind the North Korean forces and forced a dramatic and rapid withdrawal from the South. At this point, it was decided, primarily by the commander on the ground, Douglas MacArthur, to go ahead and move into North Korea and unify the country then under South Korean leadership, into a unified whole. As the American and UN forces approached the Yalu River, warnings came from the Communist Chinese that they would not tolerate this approach to their borders. Most of these warnings went unheeded, and that winter, 1950, Chinese troops intervened massively in the war and changed the entire complexion of it. The UN forces retreated to lines around the 38th parallel again, and the war continued for 2 more years without changing lines dramatically after that. In fact, the war became a fairly good example of containment policy as practiced by the United States. No longer attempting to roll back communism or unify Korea under a single leadership of the South, America and the United Nations was now satisfied to simply limit the advance of the communist forces. When the war came to an end in 1953, it was a ceasefire, an armistice, that brought the hostilities to a conclusion. The lines of combat solidified once again around the 38th parallel. The conflict between the North and South Koreans became a sideshow to the potential conflict between the United States and Communist China. Men like Douglas MacArthur advocated this war, saying that it would eventually come anyway. Other American military commanders called it the wrong war at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Lessons that the United States learned coming out of the Korean War included giving real power to the United Nations as a peacekeeping force, America's ability and even desire to commit combat troops to essential areas, and finally, an expanded commitment to Asia, a commitment that would eventually lead them into a war in Southeast Asia in Vietnam.